In the middle of all the craziness of the year 2020, we've had about 4 million new cameras be announced. And what that means is us camera nerds, we're looking at our old gear in disgust, and we've got a glint in our eye, try and get hold of that new latest and greatest technology. But if you want to be really smart about things and really take into consideration good value, you might be better off looking elsewhere other than these new cameras. In the interest of full disclosure, I did go and buy the new Canon R6, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck into this, but as it stands, this for me is reinforcing the view that my good value option still stands up to the technology on offer today. Spoiler alert, the good value option is this, the Panasonic G9. Back in November 2019, when we were all innocently walking around enjoying our lives and thinking that 2020 was going to be great, the Panasonic G9 got the firmware update of the ages. It has to stack up amongst one of the best firmware updates ever. It got 10-bit video footage, it got the variable frame rate modes of the GH5, which meant that it can now do up to 180 frames a second in slow motion, and it got HLG shooting mode for that high dynamic range. So I picked one of these up to be the B camera to my GH5 and learnt to love it. It actually inspired me to update my GH5 course to take into account the G9 and the users of that camera. So if you are looking to pick one up and you want a full how-to on how to use it, feel free to check out the discount code below. So I would define value as performance that exceeds its price point. The G9 now in the UK is about £900. That's a third less than the GH5, which for comparison is sitting at about £1,300 and has very similar features. For your £900 you're getting a 4K 60p camera that has 20 megapixels for photos. It's got a super high resolution photo mode to give you 80 megapixels. It's got class leading IBIS. It's got a rotating swivel screen that the new boys are just catching up to. It's got dual SD card slots, it's weather sealed, and it's got that 10-bit footage just like the big boys. And when you consider 10-bit alone, you have to spend quite a bit more than this to get that. So I'm pretty confident this stacks up well against its peers, and I'm going to be comparing this against some much more expensive machinery, starting with the GH5. Now it does still have some shortcomings versus the GH5 for video, such as the recording time limits, the inability to shoot all live video. It doesn't get the waveform unless you buy the Vlog upgrade separately, but it's really only the recording limit that worries me personally out of all of those. It even does some things better than the GH5 itself. For example, it's got that LCD screen on the top, which might be useful. It's got the high-res photo mode, as I mentioned, for 80 megapixel stills. And it even has animal detect autofocus. Now, I wouldn't claim that this is something that you could rely on or use very often happily, but it is there and it is something that the GH5 doesn't offer. Now, some people even say that the G9 has better autofocus and IBIS when compared to the GH5, but in my limited testing, and I did test both, I found performance on those two fronts to be comparable. Now I think you've got to be a fairly serious video person to value the difference between those two. There aren't that many shoots where I really need to go over the 30-minute recording limit, and in all honesty I like the option of 10-bit all-eye modes on the GH5, but I can't imagine an end user or a viewer of any of my films is ever going to notice the difference. So I'm going to make things really unfair and stack up this G9 against the newer full frame cameras that have come out this year. Now it's crazy to me that I even need to mention this, but when it comes to reliability, the G9 has never overheated on me, neither has the GH5. If I was shooting a wedding or an event, I would need something that is going to be able to shoot all day long and not cause any problems. When you factor in that this camera won't overheat at room temperature and that it's also freeze proof and weather sealed, it actually is a robust little camera that's got a bunch of customizable buttons on it, and it's got a nice grip to hold. You're getting one of the best IBIS performing cameras in the game, and I'm including the big new boys with that as well. It's very comparable to the Canon R6, which is the same as the Canon R5's IBIS, and it's probably better than the new Sony a7S III, although I've never tried that. And the Panasonic full frame ones, the S1 and the S1H, their IBIS is not supposed to be as good as this one. So this is amongst the best that you can get. That means you'll get smooth handheld motion with this camera as long as you're not trying to walk. The bit rates are decent on this too, and so whereas the Sony a7 III, for example, maxes out at 100 meg, this will actually pump out 150 meg when you're looking at the 4K 10-bit modes or the 4K 50 or 60p modes. That should translate to a richer image that you can push around more in post without it falling apart and without seeing the banding and stuff like that in the sky. And it's worth mentioning again that you can shoot 4K 60p with this camera, or if you knock it down to 4K 25 and below, you'll actually get 4K 25p 10-bit. The Sony a7 III, for example, is still a lot more expensive than this camera, and it can't do either of those things. You don't get 4K 60 and you don't get any 10-bit footage at all. And to comfortably beat that, you've got to be looking at like the new Canon R5 or the Sony a7S III, which will both do 4K 120p. Even some of the big boy cameras that do 4K 60, for example, the Panasonic S1H and the S1, when you activate that 4K 60 mode, you're going to get a crop and you're no longer looking at a full frame sensor. If we consider the favorite old faithful, the Sigma 18-35, then when you add a speed booster to this lens, like the Metabones 0.71 times, that image will be slightly wider than what you get on the Panasonic S5, the new full frame camera from Panasonic, when you're shooting their 4K 60 mode. So this G9 Micro Four Thirds could sometimes end up looking wider than a full frame camera if they're using cropped modes to get the resolutions that you want. This speed booster also helps to kill some of the other negatives of having a Micro Four Thirds sensor. As a quick example, this is the difference in depth of field between the Canon R6 at 1.8, this is on a 35mm lens, and this G9 on the Sigma 18-35 at f1.3. And I've tried to keep the same field of view. I'm actually at about 22mm, if I remember correctly, just trying to line up the two frames here. If I wanted to get a shallower depth of field than that on this G9, I could have moved the lens up to 35mm. That would have obviously changed the composition slightly, but that would have enabled me to get an even shallower depth of field. So it is possible on this camera, and especially if you go to a longer lens like the 42.5mm Nocticron, that's an f1.2, and if you've got your subjects fairly close to the camera, you can get a shallow depth of field. Obviously, it's going to be easier to get a shallower depth of field on a full frame, but if they aren't side by side, I'm not sure whether your casual viewer will ever know or care about that. And obviously, if you're working with a full frame camera that does crop in 4K or 4K 60, then that advantage for shallow depth of field is going to be diminished. Lens choices are vast when it comes to the G9 and the Micro Four Thirds mount. I've personally got a bunch of vintage lenses adapted to this camera with no problem. Obviously the Sigma adapted, and then obviously you've got a bunch of Micro Four Thirds lenses designed for this very mount. And I think there's a bunch of good value options in there as well, even though they can get really expensive. But they do tend to be smaller and lighter than the full frame equivalents. I also love the X telephoto mode to get a 1.4 times zoom on all of my lenses, and that's while keeping a 4K image. Now you can't even do that on the GH5S because the resolution isn't there to do that. Slow motion goes up to 180 frames a second, but I personally prefer the 100 frames a second because I shoot in 25p, so that gives me 4 times slow motion, and that for me is a good balance between really slow and decent quality. Any slower than that, and obviously the quality does take a bit of a hit. Unfortunately, just to let you know, in the really slow motion modes, you don't get audio recorded, and also you can't use the autofocus. It even shoots 5K video if you want more pixels to play with in post, maybe for some reframing. But I have to be honest and say that it's a bit gimmicky. You have to hold down the shutter button to film it. You only get 30 frames a second, and again there's no autofocus or audio recorded in that mode either. But it's still something you make with the Sony a7S III can't do. Low light performance is the biggest legitimate downside of the Micro Four Thirds system as far as I'm concerned, unless you have dual ISO, which unfortunately the G9 doesn't. That said, it's not terrible. I'll happily shoot up to ISO 2000 if I have to, and then maybe 3200 if I'm really at a push and I can denoise in post. And assuming you're shooting with fairly fast lens under sort of f2, that should give you a decent amount of light to work with, and if not, you should maybe be considering adding more light anyway to your scene. And it's not difficult to get a few decent lens options below f2 either. You've got the Lumix 25mm f1.7, which is about £100 last time I knew, so 130, 140 US dollars, something in that region. They also do the Panasonic 42.5mm f1.7, which is good value. I paid about £300 for that brand new a few years ago, so I imagine that's sitting somewhere around the 400 US dollar mark. And that was a stabilized lens as well. So paired with this G9, you'd get dual stabilization from the camera and the lens itself, and that is awesome value. But if you do work in low light situations and you can't light them up yourself, then that is a consideration that this camera is going to need denoising from about 3200 ISO. The single biggest weakness I think of this camera is the autofocus. Purists will love to remind you that stuff like the Arri cinema cameras don't come with autofocus, the older Reds don't, the Blackmagic pocket cinema cameras don't, and to be a filmmaker, then you should get used to pulling your own focus. But for me, there's no denying that it's the Achilles heel of this Panasonic GH line, and I do see value in a good autofocus system. So you've got to be really careful using it on these cameras, and if you rely on it for your job, then it's not something that I think I could recommend sort of honestly. But I do use autofocus in situations like this where it's low stakes and I can reshoot if I have to, but if it's critical, then I just can't recommend it. I will say that using manual focus is good on this camera because you've got the focus peaking, you can make the monitor black and white to make the focus peaking really stand out if you want to. And don't forget, even good autofocus cameras such as the Canon R6 is going to struggle in some situations. For example, you'll see James Matthews and Daniel Schiffer do their B-roll videos on the Sony A7 cameras, which do amazing autofocus, but they'll actually shoot those kinds of things in manual focus, just to make sure they've got what they want in focus. The 30-minute recording limit, or 10 minutes in 4K 60, is a bit of a shame, but guess what? Once you get to the end of that limit, you just hit the shutter button again and it will start recording again. Try that on a 4 grand Canon R5 after shooting 4K in its best mode, and you might find that you've got a brick in your hands for the next 20-30 minutes. Also, if you really wanted to get around that recording limit on the G9, you could look at an Atomos Ninja 5 and that will record over the HDMI continuously. So there you go. The G9 is my champion for best value camera in 2020 and can still hold its own against the new boys, in my opinion, and for the reasons that I've outlined in this video. As always, I look forward to fighting about that in the comment section below. Thanks for watching this one, and I'll see you next time.